Underneath the hard gaze of Joseph Stalin lay a rule so unyielding. It gripped the Soviet Union with fear and absolute control. Known as the man with the iron fist, Stalin turned the vast Soviet Empire into a place where even whispers could be dangerous. Who was this figure who held a nation under his thumb? And how did he build such unquestioned authority? In the dim, gray corridors of power, Stalin's name meant silence and obedience. People didn't just follow orders, they feared the slightest slip, knowing the consequences could be severe. Stalin's path to power wasn't marked by mere ambition but by a relentless, calculated strategy, one that left little room for opposition. He didn't hesitate to eliminate threats, real or imagined, creating an atmosphere so tense that few dared to challenge him. But behind that fortress of power lay a man driven by suspicion and control, a ruler who reshaped a nation's future. Stalin's legacy is layered in both triumph and terror, a mix of industrial progress and brutal purges. This is the story of the man whose name became synonymous with fear itself. Why did Stalin become such a ruthless ruler? What drove him to wield power with such relentless force? To understand this, we must look back at his early life. Only by tracing the path that shaped him can we start to see the reasons behind his iron-fisted rule. What events in his life led him to control the Soviet Union with such fear? What personal battles or harsh experiences might have transformed him into the man history remembers as the Iron Fist? The answers lie in the beginning of his story. Early life. 1878 to 1899, childhood to young adulthood. Joseph Stalin, born Ioseb Vissarionis des Jugashvili in Gori, Georgia, on December 18, 1878, December 6 in the old-style calendar, came from humble beginnings in what was then part of the Tiflis Governorate of the Russian Empire. Stalin was of Georgian ethnicity, born to Vissarion Jugashvili, a cobbler, and Ekaterine Geladze. Life in the Jugashvili household was difficult, and Stalin was the only one of their children to survive beyond infancy. His early life was marked by hardship, especially after he contracted smallpox in 1884, which left him with noticeable facial scars. At age 12, Stalin experienced another severe incident when he was struck by a Phaeton carriage, leaving him with a permanent disability in his left arm. In 1894, Stalin enrolled as a trainee priest at the Russian Orthodox Theological Seminary in Tiflis. Although he initially performed well academically, Stalin soon grew disinterested in his studies and often acted out, leading to repeated confinement as punishment for rebellious behavior. He became involved with a banned book club, where he developed a deep interest in the ideas of Karl Marx and Marxism, a growing socialist ideology that openly challenged the Tsarist regime. During this period, Stalin began attending secret workers' meetings, where he met influential figures such as Silibistro Silva Gibladze, the founder of the Georgian socialist group Mesami Desai. Drawn to the ideas of revolution and socialism, Stalin left the seminary in April 1899, setting aside his studies for a path that would lead him to political activism and eventually to power. These early years shaped his outlook and instilled in him a dedication to Marxist principles that would define his future in the Soviet Union. 1899 to 1905, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In October 1899, Stalin began working as a meteorologist at the Tiflis Observatory. While in Tiflis, he gathered a small but dedicated group of socialist supporters and co-organized a secret meeting for workers on May Day in 1900, encouraging mass strike action to support workers' rights. Stalin's growing involvement caught the attention of the empire's secret police, the Okhrana, who tried to arrest him in March 1901. He managed to evade capture by going into hiding. By November of that year, Stalin's influence had grown, and he was elected to the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, a Marxist party established just 3 years earlier. Later that month, Stalin traveled to Batumi, where his passionate and militant views caused division among local Marxists, some of whom began to suspect him of being an undercover agent. Undeterred, Stalin began working at the Rothschild refinery storehouse, where he helped organize 2 workers' strikes. When the strike leaders were arrested, Stalin co-organized a large demonstration to protest, which ultimately escalated, leading to the storming of the prison. In April 1902, after organizing yet another demonstration, Stalin was arrested and sentenced to 3 years of exile in eastern Siberia in mid-1903. Stalin escaped exile in January 1904 and returned to Tiflis, where he began co-editing a Marxist newspaper called Proletariatus Brdzola, Proletarian Struggle, with Philip Makaradze. During his time away, the RSDLP had split into 2 factions, Lenin's Bolsheviks and Julius Martov's Mensheviks. Stalin, who held deep disdain for many of the Georgian Mensheviks, chose to align himself with the Bolshevik faction, setting the stage for his future political path. 1905 to 1912, Revolution of 1905 and aftermath. In January 1905, government troops violently crushed a protest in St. Petersburg, sparking the 1905 revolution, which spread unrest throughout the Russian Empire. Stalin was in Baku in February when intense ethnic violence erupted between Armenians and Azeris. He responded by forming Bolshevik battle squads to try to separate the warring ethnic groups and restore some order. These squads were also involved in disarming the local police and soldiers, raiding arsenals, and even collecting funds by pressuring large local businesses and mines. In November 1905, Stalin's influence had grown enough that Georgian Bolsheviks elected him as a delegate to a major Bolshevik conference, where he met Lenin for the first time. In July 1906, Stalin married Kato Svanidze, and in March 1907, they welcomed their son, Yakov. Stalin quickly rose to be recognized as Georgia's main Bolshevik leader. In June of the same year, he orchestrated the robbery of a large imperial bank transport, resulting in the deaths of 40 people. He and his family then settled in Baku, where Mensheviks, troubled by his tactics, attempted to expel him from the RSDLP. During this time, Stalin worked to strengthen Bolshevik control in Baku, editing the party newspapers Bakinsky Proletary and Gudak. Tragically, in November 1907, his wife died of typhus, leaving him devastated. He left their son with her family in Tiflis and continued his activities in Baku. Stalin gathered his supporters again, organizing attacks against the anti-Semitic Black Hundreds and funding his operations through methods like racketeering, counterfeiting, robberies, and even kidnapping wealthy individuals' children for ransom. In March 1908, Stalin was arrested in Baku and imprisoned. Even in jail, he maintained leadership over the Bolshevik prisoners, set up discussion groups, and ordered the killing of suspected informants. Sentenced to 2 years of exile, he arrived in Solvyshedskotsk, Vologda province, in February 1909. By June, he managed to escape, heading to St. Petersburg. Arrested once more in March 1910, he was sent back to Solvyshedskotsk. In June 1911, he gained permission to move to Vologda, where he stayed briefly before escaping to St. Petersburg once again. This escape ended in another arrest in September 1911, leading to an additional 3-year exile in Vologda. 1912 to 1917, rise to the Central Committee and Pravda. In January 1912, the Bolshevik Central Committee was elected at the Prague Conference. Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev decided to include Stalin, seeing his background as Georgian as beneficial for gaining support from minority ethnic groups across the empire. Stalin accepted the position. The following month, he escaped to St. Petersburg and took on the task of transforming the Bolshevik weekly newspaper, Zvezda, Star, into a daily named Pravda, Truth. The new newspaper launched in April 1912, although Stalin's involvement as its editor was kept a secret. In May 1912, Stalin was arrested yet again and sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. By July, he was in the remote village of Narim, where he shared a room with fellow Bolshevik Yakov Sverdlov. After only 2 months, the two escaped back to St. Petersburg, and Stalin resumed writing and editing for Pravda. Following the October 1912 Duma elections, Stalin published articles promoting unity between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. However, Lenin criticized this stance, and Stalin eventually shifted to support Lenin's firm opposition to reunification. In early 1913, Stalin traveled to Vienna to study how the Bolsheviks could handle the empire's various national and ethnic minorities. His thoughts on the matter appeared in his article Marxism and the National Question, published in the Bolshevik journal Prosveshchenie under the pen name K. Stalin, meaning man of steel. In February 1913, Stalin was arrested again in St. Petersburg and sentenced to 4 years in exile, initially in Turkhansk. He was later moved to the remote area of Kuriga, where his isolation continued. 1917, Russian Revolution. While Stalin was still in exile, Russia entered the First World War. In October 1916, he and other exiled Bolsheviks were conscripted into the Russian army. They arrived in Krasnoyarsk in February 1917, where a medical examination deemed Stalin unfit for military service due to his injured arm. He was required to complete another 4 months of exile and successfully requested to spend this time in Akinsk. Stalin was in Akinsk when the February Revolution took place, leading to the collapse of the empire and the establishment of a provisional government. Excited by these events, Stalin made his way to Petrograd in March, where he took charge of the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, with Lev Kamenev, and became a Bolshevik representative in the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet. In July, Stalin played a part in organizing the July Days Uprising, a show of force by Bolshevik supporters. After the demonstration was suppressed, the provisional government cracked down on the Bolsheviks, even raiding Pravda's offices. Stalin managed to help Lenin escape and kept him hidden in various safe houses around Petrograd, ultimately helping him reach Razlov for greater safety. With Lenin in hiding, Stalin continued to edit Pravda and acted as the party's leader, overseeing its 6th Congress. Stalin fully supported Lenin's call for the Bolsheviks to overthrow the provisional government and seize power. On October 24, government forces raided the Bolshevik newspaper offices, smashing the machinery and presses, but Stalin managed to salvage some equipment. Early on October 25, Stalin joined Lenin at the Smolny Institute, where the Bolshevik-led October Revolution was directed. Stalin's role was focused on briefing Bolshevik delegates of the Second Congress of Soviets on the unfolding situation, keeping him out of the public eye. Although some opponents later claimed this meant his role was minor, historians recognize that his work as a member of the Central Committee and editor of Pravda was crucial to the party's activities during this pivotal time in Lenin's government. In October 1917, Lenin declared himself the leader of the new government, called the Council of People's Commissars. Stalin quickly became part of Lenin's core leadership team, strengthening his position within the Bolshevik movement. He helped Lenin by co-signing orders to shut down newspapers that opposed the Bolsheviks, and co-led the group that drafted a new constitution for the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Leaving his position as editor of Pravda, Stalin was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, a role in which he addressed the concerns of the empire's diverse ethnic groups. He worked closely with Nadezhda Alalieva, whom he later married, and in November 1917, he signed the Decree on Nationality, which allowed ethnic minorities the right to independence and self-governance. Shortly after, he met with Finnish Social Democrats and granted Finland's request for independence in December. As the First World War continued, the government relocated from Petrograd to the Kremlin in Moscow in March 1918 for safety. By May 1918, as Russia struggled with a civil war and food shortages, Stalin was sent to Tsaritsyn, later known as Stalingrad, to oversee food procurement in southern Russia. Eager to prove himself, he took command of the local military operations. Stalin dispatched large groups of Red Army soldiers to fight the anti-Bolshevik White Armies in the area, which resulted in high casualties. He also instructed the local Cheka security branch to execute suspected enemies without trial and purged military and food agencies of middle-class specialists, whom he ordered executed as well. His severe tactics went beyond what many Bolshevik leaders considered acceptable. In December 1918, Stalin established decrees recognizing Soviet republics in Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, which had adopted Marxist governments. In February 1920, he was placed in charge of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate and was soon moved to the Caucasian Front. The Polish-Soviet War began in 1920, with Polish forces invading Ukraine. In May, Stalin was reassigned to Ukraine and set his sights on capturing Lvov. He prioritized this goal, disregarding orders to send reinforcements to Mikhail Tukhachevsky's forces attacking Warsaw. Stalin returned to Moscow in mid-August to attend a Politburo meeting, where Tukhachevsky blamed him for the Soviet defeat at the Battle of Warsaw. Feeling humiliated, Stalin asked to resign from his military duties, which was accepted on September 1. Later, at the Ninth Party Conference in September, Trotsky openly criticized Stalin for making strategic mistakes and alleged that Stalin's actions had weakened the campaign. This experience left Stalin feeling disgraced, intensifying his hostility toward Trotsky. 1921 to 1924, Lenin's final years. In April 1921, Stalin directed the Red Army to re-establish control in Turkestan. As the People's Commissar for Nationalities, Stalin felt each ethnic group should have the right to express its unique culture and manage certain local matters. He supported the concept of autonomous republics within the Russian state, where ethnic groups could oversee regional affairs. However, this position stirred debate within the party. Some Marxists felt Stalin leaned too far toward bourgeois nationalism, while others saw him as too focused on Russian interests. In March 1921, Stalin and Nadezhda welcomed their son, Vasily. Back in his home region of the Caucasus, Stalin opposed creating separate autonomous republics, arguing these could lead to the oppression of smaller ethnic groups within those areas. Instead, he promoted the idea of a united Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. His proposal was met with resistance from the Georgian Communist Party, sparking the Georgian Affair. In mid-1921, Stalin returned to the South Caucasus, urging Georgian communists to avoid aggressive nationalism, which he believed was marginalizing the Abkhazian, Ossetian, and Agarian minorities. After the Civil War, Trotsky led a group that wanted to eliminate trade unions. But Lenin disagreed, and Stalin joined Lenin's side, helping rally opposition to Trotsky's plan. At the 11th Party Congress in early 1922, Lenin recommended Stalin for the new position of General Secretary. Though some worried this post would grant Stalin too much power, he was appointed. In May 1922, Lenin suffered a major stroke, leaving him partly paralyzed. Living at his Gorky dacha, Lenin mainly communicated with Sovnarkom through Stalin. However, Lenin grew concerned about Stalin's crudeness and expressed this in a note that later became known as Lenin's Testament. Lenin suggested Stalin should be replaced by someone more tolerant and considerate. The two leaders also had different ideas about the structure of the Soviet state. Eventually, a compromise led to the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. As Lenin's health declined, his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, shared Lenin's testament with other key leaders, emphasizing Lenin's concerns about Stalin's character and urging his removal as General Secretary. Although some have questioned the document's authenticity, most historians accept it as a true reflection of Lenin's views, and Stalin never publicly challenged its legitimacy. Consolidation of power. 1924 to 1928, succeeding Lenin. After Lenin passed away in January 1924, Stalin took charge of organizing his funeral and served as a pallbearer. To present himself as a devoted follower of Lenin, Stalin gave 9 lectures at Sverdlov University on the foundations of Leninism. During the 13th Party Congress in 1924, Lenin's testament was read only to the leaders of the provincial delegations. Feeling embarrassed by its contents, Stalin offered to resign from his position as General Secretary, but he was ultimately kept in the role. As General Secretary, Stalin had significant control over appointments within the party. He preferred to promote newer party members from working-class backgrounds instead of the old Bolsheviks, who were often middle-class university graduates. This strategy allowed him to place loyal supporters in key positions across different regions of the Soviet Union. Stalin maintained regular communication with younger party officials, and many provincial leaders sought to impress him to advance their careers. He developed strong relationships with key figures in the secret police, including Felix Dzerzhinsky, Genrikh Yagoda, and Vyacheslav Menzinsky. In his personal life, Stalin balanced time between his apartment in the Kremlin and a dacha in Zabalova. His wife gave birth to a daughter, Svetlana, in February 1926. Following Lenin's death, a power struggle erupted to determine his successor, with prominent figures such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky vying for influence. Stalin viewed Trotsky, whom he personally disliked, as the biggest threat to his authority. During Lenin's illness, Stalin had formed an unofficial alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev to oppose Trotsky. Although Zinoviev was worried about Stalin's rising power, he decided to support him at the 13th Congress as a way to counter Trotsky, who was now leading a faction known as the Left Opposition. The Left Opposition criticized the new economic policy, NEP, for conceding too much to capitalist ideas, labeling Stalin a rightist for backing the policy. Stalin gradually built a network of supporters within the Central Committee while members of the Left Opposition were systematically pushed out of their influential positions. By late 1924, Stalin began targeting Kamenev and Zinoviev, removing their allies from important roles. In 1925, Kamenev and Zinoviev openly opposed Stalin and Bukharin, attempting an unsuccessful challenge against their faction at the 14th Party Congress in December. Stalin accused them of fostering factionalism, which he claimed led to instability. By mid-1926, Kamenev and Zinoviev allied with Trotsky to form the United Opposition against Stalin. In October of that year, the two agreed to halt factional activities under the threat of expulsion and later publicly recanted their opposition. Factional disputes continued, with Stalin threatening to resign multiple times in 1926 and 1927. In October 1927, Zinoviev and Trotsky were removed from the Central Committee. Trotsky was subsequently exiled to Kazakhstan and then expelled from the country in 1929. With these actions, Stalin established himself as the supreme leader of the Communist Party. He handed the head of government position to Vyacheslav Molotov and ensured that his allies held key roles in state institutions. Stalin's growing power was also reflected in the renaming of places in his honor. In June 1924, the Ukrainian mining town of Yuzovka was renamed Stalino, and in April 1925, Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad. In 1926, Stalin published a significant work titled On Questions of Leninism, where he argued for the idea of socialism in one country, framing it as a legitimate interpretation of Leninist thought. 1928 to 1932, First Five-Year Plan. Economic policy of Stalin. Stalin recognized that the Soviet Union was lagging far behind more developed countries, estimating a gap of 50 to 100 years. He believed it was crucial to close this gap in just 10 years, as failure to do so could lead to dire consequences for the country and its people. In February 1931, he expressed that this was not just a goal but a responsibility towards the workers and peasants of the USSR. During this time, the Soviet Union faced significant challenges in its agricultural sector, particularly a grain shortfall. In 1927, the harvest produced only 70% of what had been gathered the previous year. Stalin's government was worried about potential attacks from other nations, and many communists, including members of the Komsomol, the youth division of the Communist Party, the OGPU, the secret police, and the Red Army, sought to end the new economic policy, NEP. They believed it favored wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, and small business owners called NEP men. In reaction, Stalin shifted away from the NEP, positioning himself to the left of even Trotsky and Zinoviev, who were his rivals. In early 1928, during a trip to Novosibirsk, Stalin accused kulaks of hoarding grain. He ordered their arrest and the confiscation of their grain supplies. Upon returning to Moscow, he brought back a large quantity of grain. Stalin's directives led to the formation of grain procurement squads in West Siberia and the Urals, where violent clashes erupted between these squads and local peasants. He insisted that both kulaks and middle peasants should be coerced into releasing their harvests. This aggressive stance upset many Central Committee members, including Bukharin, who felt sidelined by these decisions. By January 1930, the Politburo had agreed to the liquidation of the kulak class. This meant many kulaks were exiled to remote areas or sent to concentration camps. By mid-1930, over 320,000 households were impacted by this policy of dekulakization, which biographer Dmitry Volkogonov described as the first mass terror implemented by Stalin within his own country. In 1929, the Politburo declared the mass collectivization of agriculture, which meant establishing collective farms called kolkhozes and state farms known as sovkhozes. Although joining these collectives was officially voluntary, many peasants felt pressured to participate, fearing they might suffer the same fate as the kulaks. By 1932, around 62% of agricultural households were part of collectives, rising to 90% by 1936. However, many collectivized farmers resented losing their private land, which led to a decline in productivity. Famine struck several areas, prompting the Politburo to frequently issue emergency food relief. Resistance to dekulakization and collectivization manifested in armed uprisings by peasants, particularly in Ukraine, the North Caucasus, southern Russia, and Central Asia. These uprisings peaked in March 1930 and were swiftly suppressed by the military. In response to the unrest, Stalin published an article stating that collectivization was voluntary and attributed the violence to local officials. Bukharin, despite his long-standing alliance with Stalin, expressed concern over these developments, fearing a return to the old war communism policies. However, by mid-1928, he found it challenging to garner enough support within the party to oppose Stalin's reforms. In November 1929, Stalin removed Bukharin from the Politburo. The Soviet Union officially claimed to have replaced the inefficiencies of a market economy with a planned economy structured around long-term goals. In practice, however, economic decisions were often based on short-term directives. In 1928, the first five-year plan was introduced, aiming primarily at boosting heavy industry. Remarkably, this plan was completed a year ahead of schedule, by 1932. The country underwent significant economic changes, with new mines opening, cities like Magnitogorsk being constructed, and work beginning on the White Sea-Baltic Canal. Millions of peasants moved to urban areas, but housing construction could not keep pace with this influx. Many major projects, such as the White Sea-Baltic Canal and the Moscow Metro, relied heavily on forced labor. As a result, workers lost control over industrial processes, and factory managers gained more authority and privileges. Stalin justified wage disparities by referring to Marx's view that such differences were necessary during the early stages of socialism. To boost labor productivity, Stalin introduced medals, awards, and the Stakhanovite movement, which aimed to encourage hard work among the population. Stalin asserted that socialism was taking root in the Soviet Union at a time when capitalism was faltering globally due to the Great Depression. His speeches and writings reflected a grand vision of the Soviet Union achieving unprecedented heights of human progress, striving to create what he called a new Soviet person, cultural and foreign policy. In 1928, Stalin warned that the struggle between the working class and their enemies would become more intense as socialism progressed. He pointed out a danger from the right, meaning he saw threats from those who were not fully supportive of communist policies. The first significant show trial in the Soviet Union was the Shakhty trial that same year, where some middle-class factory experts were accused of sabotage and were found guilty. From 1929 to 1930, several show trials were held to intimidate those who opposed Stalin's ideas. These trials included the Industrial Party trial, the Menshevik trial, and the Metrovikers trial. Stalin was aware that many ethnic Russians might have concerns about being ruled by a leader from Georgia, his home region. To address this, he promoted ethnic Russians to important positions in the government and made Russian the required language in schools. In areas with many non-Russian people, Russian was taught alongside local languages. At the same time, Stalin suppressed nationalist feelings among ethnic minorities. He also pushed conservative social policies to strengthen families and increase the population. This included emphasizing the importance of family and motherhood, making homosexuality illegal again, restricting access to abortion and divorce, and getting rid of the Zanatal, which was a department focused on women's issues. Stalin aimed for a cultural revolution, wanting to create a culture that served the common people while also sharing aspects of the more elite culture. He oversaw the establishment of more schools, newspapers, and libraries, which helped improve literacy and basic education. In the arts, he promoted a style called socialist realism and sought the support of famous writers like Maxim Gorky and Mikhail Sholokhov. He also supported scientists whose work aligned with his version of Marxism, such as Trofim Lysenko. Even when many in the scientific community dismissed Lysenko's research as unscientific, the government stepped up its anti-religious campaigns, increasing support for the League of Militant Atheists. This led to the persecution of religious leaders, including priests and imams, and the destruction of religious buildings. One notable example was the demolition of Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior in 1931 to clear space for the Palace of the Soviets. Despite the government's efforts, many people still identified as religious. A census in 1937 revealed that 57% of respondents admitted to being religious. In the 1920s, Stalin also focused on foreign policy. He met with various Western visitors, including writers George Bernard Shaw and H. G. Wells, who were both impressed by him. Through the Communist International, Stalin's government influenced Marxist parties around the world. Initially, he let Nikolai Bukharin manage this organization. However, during the 6th Congress in July 1928, Stalin told delegates that the biggest threat to socialism came from non-Marxist socialists and social democrats, whom he labeled social fascists. He recognized that in many nations, these groups were the main competitors for support from the working class. Bukharin was concerned that this focus on leftist rivals overlooked the rising threat of fascism and far-right movements in Europe. After Bukharin was removed from power, Stalin placed the Communist International under the control of Dmitry Manuelsky and Osip Pyatnitsky. In 1929, a personal tragedy struck Stalin when his son Yakov attempted suicide. He shot himself in the chest but narrowly missed his heart. Stalin reacted harshly, reportedly saying, "He can't even shoot straight." His relationship with his wife, Nadezhda, was troubled, marked by frequent arguments and her struggles with mental health. In November 1932, after a dinner at the Kremlin where Stalin flirted with other women, Nadezhda tragically shot herself in the heart. The official explanation for her death was appendicitis, and Stalin hid the true cause from their children. After her death, those close to Stalin noticed he became much colder emotionally, showing a significant change in his personality. 1932 to 1939, major crises. Famine of 1932 to 1933. Throughout the Soviet Union, many people were unhappy with Stalin's government. This dissatisfaction led to social unrest in cities, which forced Stalin to relax some of his economic policies in 1932. In May of that year, he introduced kolkhoz markets where farmers could sell their extra crops. However, the government also imposed stricter penalties. A decree in August 1932 made it a capital offense to steal even a small amount of grain. The second five-year plan aimed to improve living conditions, housing, and the production of consumer goods, reducing the quotas set in the first plan. Additionally, after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Stalin increased the focus on producing military weapons. The Soviet Union faced a catastrophic famine between 1932 and 1933, resulting in the deaths of 5 to 7 million people. The hardest-hit regions included Ukraine, where the famine was known as the Holodomor, as well as southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus. Some historians argue that the famine in Ukraine was a deliberate act by Stalin to suppress a possible independence movement, although there are no documents proving he explicitly ordered starvation. The famine was worsened by poor weather and several years of declining agricultural productivity. Stalin's rapid industrialization policies, the neglect of proper crop rotation, and the failure to store enough grain contributed to the famine. He blamed the suffering on supposed hostile elements and sabotage by peasants. The government offered limited food aid to rural areas affected by the famine, prioritizing the needs of urban workers. This indicated that Stalin valued the progress of Soviet industrialization more than the lives of the peasants. As a result, grain exports plummeted. Stalin did not accept responsibility for his policy's contribution to the famine, and the situation was concealed from foreign observers. In terms of ideology and foreign relations, Stalin oversaw the adoption of a new constitution in 1936 that included liberal features, mainly for propaganda purposes. He claimed that socialism, the first phase of communism, has been achieved. In 1938, the Soviet Union published the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, which biographer Robert Conquest described as the central text of Stalinism. The government also released authorized biographies of Stalin, who preferred to be seen as a representation of the Communist Party rather than as an individual with a personal story. In an effort to improve international relations, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations in 1934 after having been excluded before. In October 1933, shortly after Hitler took power, Stalin initiated secret communications with him. Stalin admired how Hitler eliminated rivals within the Nazi Party during the Night of the Long Knives. However, he also recognized the danger posed by fascism and aimed to establish better relations with liberal democracies in Western Europe. In May 1935, the Soviet Union signed a treaty of mutual assistance with France and Czechoslovakia. At the 7th Congress of the Communist International in July and August of that year, the Soviet government encouraged Marxist-Leninists to unite with other leftist groups to form a popular front against fascism. When the Spanish Civil War began in July 1936, the Soviet Union provided military assistance to the Republican faction. This support included sending 648 aircraft, 407 tanks, 3,000 Soviet troops, and 42,000 members of the international brigades. Stalin was personally involved in the situation in Spain. Meanwhile, Germany and Italy supported the nationalist faction, which ultimately triumphed in March 1939. With the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in July 1937, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with China. Stalin supported the Chinese Communist Party, which had paused its civil war with the Kuomintang, KMT, nationalists to create a united front against Japanese aggression. Great Purge. Stalin's approach to state repression was often inconsistent. In May 1933, he decided to release many people who had been convicted of minor crimes, instructing the security services not to carry out more mass arrests or deportations. However, in September 1934, he set up a commission to look into wrongful imprisonments, while simultaneously calling for the execution of workers at the Stalin metallurgical factory who were accused of spying for Japan. After the murder of Sergei Kirov in December 1934, Stalin grew increasingly worried about threats to his life. This led to a rise in state repression. He issued a decree that allowed NKVD troikas, special committees, to hand out sentences without involving the courts. In 1935, Stalin ordered the NKVD to remove suspected counter-revolutionaries from cities, resulting in over 11,000 expulsions from Leningrad alone during the early part of that year. In 1936, Nikolai Yezhov became the head of the NKVD. Under his leadership, Stalin organized the arrest and execution of many of his remaining opponents in the Communist Party during a campaign known as the Great Purge. The first Moscow trial in August 1936 led to the execution of key figures like Kamenev and Zinoviev. The second trial occurred in January 1937, followed by a third in March 1938, which saw Bukharin and Rykov executed. By late 1937, Stalin had effectively eliminated all collective leadership from the Politburo, consolidating power in his hands. Mass expulsions from the Communist Party took place, with Stalin instructing foreign communist parties to remove anti-Stalin elements. This resulted in a new group of younger officials loyal to Stalin replacing most of the old guard. Party functionaries carried out Stalin's orders eagerly, often exceeding their quotas for arrests and executions to win his favor and avoid becoming targets themselves. Repression intensified from December 1936 to November 1938. In May 1937, Stalin ordered the arrest of much of the military leadership, which led to widespread arrests. By late 1937, the purges extended beyond the Communist Party and targeted the general population. In July 1937, the Politburo initiated a purge of anti-Soviet elements, focusing on anti-Stalin Bolsheviks, former Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, priests, ex-White Army soldiers, and common criminals. Stalin also initiated national operations, targeting non-Soviet ethnic groups like Poles, Germans, Latvians, Finns, Greeks, Koreans, and Chinese for internal or external exile. More than 1.6 million people were arrested during this time, with around 700,000 executed and countless others dying under torture. The NKVD even carried out assassinations of defectors and opponents abroad. Most notably the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico in August 1940, which eliminated Stalin's last major rival. Stalin personally directed many operations during the purges and made all key decisions. Historians discuss his motives, noting that his writings from this period were often confusing and filled with claims about enemies surrounding him. He was particularly worried about the possibility of a domestic fifth column if war broke out with Japan or Germany, especially after right-wing forces took power in Spain. The Great Purge came to an end when Yezhov was replaced by Lavrentiy Beria, who was completely loyal to Stalin. Yezhov was arrested in April 1939 and executed in 1940. The purges severely damaged the Soviet Union's reputation abroad, particularly among those sympathetic to leftist causes. As the purges concluded, Stalin sought to shift the blame for the excesses and illegal actions onto Yezhov, distancing himself from responsibility for what had happened. World War II. 1939 to 1941, pact with Nazi Germany. As a Marxist-Leninist, Stalin believed that conflict between capitalist countries was unavoidable. After Nazi Germany annexed Austria and then parts of Czechoslovakia in 1938, he recognized that war was approaching. To maintain Soviet neutrality, he hoped that a war between Germany and the Western powers, such as France and Britain, would allow the Soviet Union to gain influence in Europe. Additionally, the Soviet Union faced threats from the East, as its troops had clashes with the expansionist Japanese in the late 1930s. In response to these pressures, Stalin began a military buildup. The Red Army more than doubled in size between January 1939 and June 1941, although many of the new officers were poorly trained due to the rush to expand. Between 1940 and 1941, Stalin also purged the military, creating a serious shortage of trained officers when war eventually broke out. As Britain and France seemed hesitant to form an alliance with the Soviet Union, Stalin looked for a better opportunity with Germany. On May 3, 1939, he replaced his Western-oriented foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, with Vyacheslav Molotov. Germany then began negotiations with the Soviet Union, proposing a division of Eastern Europe between the two powers. Stalin viewed this as a chance for territorial growth and a temporary peace. In August 1939, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, a non-aggression agreement negotiated by Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. Just a week later, Germany invaded Poland, prompting the UK and France to declare war on Germany. On September 17, the Red Army entered eastern Poland, officially claiming to restore order amid the collapse of the Polish state. By September 28, Germany and the Soviet Union exchanged territories they had conquered. And a German-Soviet frontier treaty was signed shortly after, with Stalin present. The two nations continued to trade, undermining the British blockade of Germany. The Soviets also demanded parts of eastern Finland, but the Finnish government refused. Consequently, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939, beginning what became known as the Winter War. Despite being outnumbered, the Finnish forces successfully resisted the Red Army. International opinion supported Finland, leading to the Soviet Union's expulsion from the League of Nations. Embarrassed by their inability to defeat the Finns, the Soviets signed a temporary peace treaty in which they received some territorial concessions from Finland. In June 1940, the Red Army occupied the Baltic states, which were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union by August. Additionally, the Soviets invaded and annexed Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, territories in Romania. To prevent dissent in these newly acquired territories, the Soviets carried out mass repressions. A notable event during this time was the Katyn massacre in April and May 1940, where around 22,000 members of the Polish armed forces, police, and intelligentsia were executed by the NKVD. The speed of Germany's victory over an occupation of France in mid-1940 surprised Stalin. As a result, he began to focus on appeasing the Germans to delay a conflict with them. After the Tripartite Pact was signed by Germany, Japan, and Italy in October 1940, Stalin proposed that the Soviet Union join the Axis alliance. To demonstrate peaceful intentions, the Soviets signed a neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941. By this time, Stalin had effectively led the country for nearly 15 years, and concluded that his relationship with Germany had deteriorated to the point where he needed to be the official head of government. On May 6, he replaced Molotov as Premier of the Soviet Union, marking a significant shift in his leadership role. 1941 to 1942, German invasion. In June 1941, Germany launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, marking the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front. Despite several warnings from intelligence agencies about Germany's plans, Stalin was caught off guard. He quickly organized a state defense committee and took on the role of supreme commander. He also set up a military command, known as Stavka, with Georgy Zhukov as chief of staff. The German military strategy, called Blitzkrieg, was very effective at first, within just 2 days. The Soviet Air Force in the western border regions was largely destroyed. The German army advanced rapidly into Soviet territory. They captured Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, and laid siege to Leningrad. As a result of the invasion, many Soviet citizens fled to Moscow and nearby cities. By July, German bombers were attacking Moscow, and by October, the German forces were preparing for a full assault on the capital. Although there were plans for the Soviet government to evacuate to Kuibyshev, Stalin chose to stay in Moscow, fearing that his departure would harm the morale of the troops. The German advance toward Moscow was eventually stopped after 2 months of intense fighting, made even more challenging by the harsh winter weather. Against the advice of Zhukov and other military leaders, Stalin emphasized aggressive attacks rather than defensive strategies. In June 1941, he ordered a scorched earth policy, which meant destroying infrastructure and food supplies before the Germans could capture them. He also commanded the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to execute about 100,000 political prisoners in areas threatened by the German army. Stalin continued to purge the military leadership, demoting or removing high-ranking officials, and arresting or executing others. With Order No. 270, he directed soldiers to fight to the death instead of surrendering, labeling anyone who was captured as a traitor. Stalin's own son, Yakov, was captured by the Germans and died in their custody after Stalin refused to negotiate for his release. In July 1942, he issued Order No. 227, stating that unauthorized retreat would lead to soldiers being assigned to penal battalions, which were essentially used as cannon fodder on the front lines. During this time, both the German and Soviet armies ignored the rules of war outlined in the Geneva Conventions. The Soviets made sure to publicize the Nazi atrocities committed against communists, Jews, and Romani people. Stalin also took advantage of Nazi anti-Semitism by sponsoring the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in April 1942 to gain support from the global Jewish community for the Soviet war effort. The Soviet Union formed alliances with the United Kingdom and the United States. Although the US joined the war against Germany in 1941, significant American support for the Soviets did not arrive until late 1942. In response to the invasion, the Soviets expanded their industry in Central Russia, focusing almost entirely on military production. Their productivity soared, surpassing that of Germany. During the war, Stalin became more accepting of the Russian Orthodox Church, allowing it to resume some activities and even meeting with Patriarch Sergius in September 1943. He also permitted a broader range of cultural expression, allowing previously suppressed writers and artists, such as Anna Akhmatova and Dmitry Shostakovich, to share their works more widely. The country's national anthem was changed from the Internationale to a more patriotic song. The government began to promote pan-Slavist sentiment and encouraged criticism of rootless cosmopolitanism, which negatively affected many Soviet Jews. The Communist International was dissolved in 1943. And Stalin encouraged Marxist-Leninist parties in other countries to focus on nationalism rather than internationalism to gain more support at home. In April 1942, Stalin made a critical decision to order the Soviet Union's first significant counteroffensive, targeting German-occupied Kharkov in eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, this attack failed. During the same year, Hitler changed his focus from overall victory in the Eastern Front to securing the vital oil fields in the southern Soviet Union, which were essential for Germany's long-term war efforts. While Soviet generals believed Hitler was planning a strategic move to encircle Moscow, Stalin thought he was launching another attempt to take the capital. In June 1942, the German army initiated a major offensive in southern Russia, posing a threat to the city of Stalingrad. Stalin ordered the Red Army to defend the city at all costs. This led to the grueling Battle of Stalingrad, which turned out to be the bloodiest and most intense battle of the entire war. By February 1943, the German forces besieging Stalingrad surrendered, marking a crucial turning point in the war. In honor of this significant victory, Stalin declared himself Marshal of the Soviet Union on March 6, 1943. 1942 to 1945, Soviet counterattack. By November 1942, the Soviets began to push back against the German Southern Campaign. Although the Soviet Union suffered about 2.5 million casualties in this effort, it allowed them to take the offensive for most of the war on the Eastern Front. In the summer of 1943, Germany launched a significant attack at Kursk, but the Soviets successfully defended against it. By the end of that year, the Soviets had reclaimed about half of the territory that had previously been occupied by the Germans. The industrial output of the Soviet military also increased significantly from late 1941 to early 1943. Stalin moved factories far to the east of the front lines, keeping them safe from invasion and aerial attacks. As a result, production rates surpassed those of Germany. In countries allied with the Soviet Union, Stalin's image became more favorable as the war progressed. In 1941, the London Philharmonic Orchestra held a concert to celebrate his birthday. And in 1942, Time magazine named him Man of the Year. Initially, when Stalin heard that people in the West called him Uncle Joe, he felt offended, thinking it was undignified. Despite their alliance, there were still suspicions among Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, known as the Big Three. Churchill visited Stalin in Moscow twice, in August 1942 and October 1944. However, Stalin rarely left Moscow during the war, which frustrated Roosevelt and Churchill because he was reluctant to meet them. In November 1943, Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt in Tehran, a location he selected. The meeting went well, especially between Stalin and Roosevelt, as both wanted to see the British Empire dismantled after the war. At this conference, they agreed that to prevent Germany from becoming a military power again, the country should be broken into smaller states. Roosevelt and Churchill also agreed to Stalin's demand that the German city of Königsberg be recognized as Soviet territory. Stalin was eager for the UK and US to open a Western Front, which would relieve pressure on the Soviet forces. This action eventually took place in mid-1944. Stalin insisted that the Soviet Union should keep the parts of Poland it occupied in 1939, a proposal that Churchill opposed. Later, in discussions about the Balkans, Churchill agreed to Stalin's idea that Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia would fall under Soviet influence after the war, while Greece would remain aligned with the West. In 1944, the Soviet Union made significant advances across Eastern Europe toward Germany. One of the major offensives was Operation Bagration, which targeted the German Army Group Center in Belarusia. That year, Soviet forces pushed German armies out of the Baltic states, which were re-annexed into the Soviet Union. As the Red Army reconquered the Caucasus and Crimea, various ethnic groups in those regions, such as the Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingushi, Karachak, Balkars, and Crimean Tatars, were accused of collaborating with the Germans. Under the principle of collective responsibility, Stalin's government abolished the autonomous republics of these groups. The Red Army did not provide help to Polish resistance fighters during the Warsaw Uprising, as Stalin believed that any successful Polish forces could threaten his plans for control over Poland. He placed great importance on capturing Berlin before the Western Allies, believing this would help him secure more of Europe under Soviet control. Churchill was concerned about this and tried unsuccessfully to persuade the US to adopt a similar goal. 1945, victory. In April 1945, the Red Army captured Berlin, leading to Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender in May. Stalin had hoped to capture Hitler alive, and to prevent his remains from becoming a symbol for Nazi supporters. He arranged for them to be taken to Moscow. Following the fall of Berlin, many Soviet soldiers were involved in acts of looting, pillaging, and rape throughout Germany and parts of Eastern Europe. Stalin chose not to punish these soldiers for their actions. With Germany defeated, Stalin shifted his attention to Japan, moving 500,000 troops to the Far East. His allies pressured him to join the war against Japan, as he aimed to strengthen the Soviet Union's position in Asia. On August 8, 1945, just after the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet army invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria and defeated the Guangdong Army. This invasion contributed to Japan's surrender and the conclusion of World War II. At the Potsdam Conference held in July and August 1945, Stalin reaffirmed his earlier commitment not to pursue a Sovietization of Eastern Europe. However, he advocated for reparations from Germany without considering the basic needs of German citizens, which concerned US President Harry Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They feared that excessive reparations would turn Germany into a financial burden on Western powers. Stalin also sought war booty, allowing the Soviet Union to seize property from conquered countries without restrictions. A clause permitting this with some limitations was eventually added. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, US, British, and French. Berlin, located within the Soviet zone, was also divided into these 4 areas. Post-war era. 1945 to 1947, post-war reconstruction. After World War II, Joseph Stalin found himself at the peak of his power. According to historian Robert Service, he was seen as a symbol of victory and patriotism within the Soviet Union. His armies had gained control of Central and Eastern Europe, reaching as far as the River Elbe. In June 1945, Stalin took the title of Generalissimo, a mark of his authority. He watched a grand parade in Red Square, led by General Georgy Zhukov, celebrating the Soviet victory. At a banquet for military commanders, he declared the Russian people as the outstanding nation and leading force within the Soviet Union. This was the first time he openly prioritized Russians over other nationalities in the USSR. In 1946, the Soviet state published Stalin's collected works, showcasing his ideas and policies. By 1947, a new edition of his official biography was released, praising him even more than the first version. His speeches were quoted daily in Pravda, the Communist Party's newspaper, and his images were everywhere in homes and workplaces. Despite his strengthened position, Stalin remained wary of internal dissent and the public's desire for change. He was particularly concerned about soldiers returning from Germany, who had seen many consumer goods and luxuries while there. Remembering the 1825 Decembrist revolt, which involved soldiers returning from the Napoleonic Wars, Stalin implemented strict measures. Returning Soviet prisoners of war were sent to filtration camps, where they were interrogated to determine if they were traitors. Out of the 2.8 million who went through these camps, about half were imprisoned in labor camps. In the Baltic states, where there was significant resistance to Soviet control, Stalin launched programs aimed at decolonization, removing wealthier peasants, and declericalization, removing religious influences. These efforts resulted in the deportation of around 142,000 people between 1945 and 1949. The Gulag system of forced labor camps continued to expand. And by January 1953, about 3% of the Soviet population was either imprisoned or in internal exile. This included 2.8 million in special settlements and another 2.5 million in various camps, penal colonies, and prisons. Stalin ordered the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to assess the destruction caused by the war. They found that 1,710 towns and 70,000 villages had been destroyed. Their report indicated that between 26 and 27 million Soviet citizens had died, with millions more wounded, malnourished, or orphaned. In the aftermath, some of Stalin's advisors suggested changes to government policies. Soviet society became more tolerant in some respects compared to the pre-war period. For example, Stalin allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to keep the churches that had opened during the war. Additionally, academia and the arts were given slightly more freedom. Recognizing the need for strong economic recovery measures, Stalin's government devalued the ruble and ended the food rationing system in December 1947. Although capital punishment was abolished that same year, it was reintroduced in 1950. Stalin's health began to decline, and he grew increasingly paranoid that senior officials might try to remove him from power. He demoted prominent figure Vyacheslav Molotov while favoring others like Lavrentiy Beria and Georgy Malenkov for key roles. During the Leningrad affair, many city leaders were accused of treachery, leading to their purge and execution in 1950. In the years following the war, food shortages became common in Soviet cities. The USSR faced a significant famine from 1946 to 1947. This famine was triggered by a drought and poor harvests in 1946. And it worsened due to government policies that prioritized stockpiling and exporting food instead of distributing it to areas in need. Estimates suggest that between 1 million and 1.5 million people died from malnutrition and related diseases. While agricultural production stagnated, Stalin turned his focus to major infrastructure projects. He initiated the construction of hydroelectric plants, canals, and railway lines reaching the polar north. Many of these projects were built using prison labor, highlighting the harsh realities of the post-war Soviet regime. 1947 to 1950, Cold War policy. The Cold War and Soviet nuclear development. After World War II, the British Empire's influence declined, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union as the two dominant world powers. Although they had been allies during the war, growing tensions between these countries soon led to the Cold War. Publicly, Stalin accused the US and British governments of aggression. But privately he thought an immediate war with them was unlikely, expecting that peace could hold for several decades. Still, Stalin took no chances and ordered a significant acceleration in Soviet nuclear research to develop an atomic bomb. He saw the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons, noting that their use would likely mean global devastation. Despite these concerns, he took a personal interest in the Soviet atomic program. By August 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb in the deserts near Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. Alongside nuclear advancements, Stalin oversaw a major military buildup. In 1949, the Soviet army numbered 2.9 million soldiers, but by 1953, this had nearly doubled to 5.8 million. Meanwhile, the United States began to assert its influence across various continents. The U.S. secured Air Force bases in Africa and Asia and promoted pro-American governments throughout Latin America. In June 1947, it launched the Marshall Plan, offering financial assistance to European countries devastated by the war. However, this aid came with conditions that required countries to open their markets. Knowing the Soviet Union would never agree to such terms. This plan also aimed to weaken Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Internationally, tensions rose when the Western Allies demanded that Stalin withdraw the Soviet Red Army from northern Iran. Initially, Stalin refused, resulting in a serious diplomatic crisis in 1946. But he eventually pulled out a year later. He sought to extend Soviet influence globally, even trying to make Libya, recently freed from Italian occupation, a Soviet protectorate, although this attempt was unsuccessful. Stalin also prioritized having a Soviet role in the newly formed United Nations, UN. He sent Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to negotiations in San Francisco, where he secured the Soviet Union a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. In 1949, the Western capitalist powers, led by the United States, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance intended to counterbalance Soviet influence. In Western countries, Stalin's reputation continued to worsen, with many viewing him as an oppressive dictator, often comparing him to Adolf Hitler. Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Alliliyeva, later reported that he once remarked, "Together with the Germans, we would have been invincible." In 1948, Stalin edited and added to Falsifiers of History, a publication initially released as a series of articles in the Soviet newspaper Pravda, and later compiled into a book. It addressed revelations about the 1939 Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, attempting to shift the blame for the war onto Western powers. Stalin argued that the initial German successes during their 1941 invasion were due not to Soviet military weaknesses but to a premeditated Soviet strategic withdrawal. In December 1949, Stalin's 70th birthday, though he was actually turning 71, was marked by widespread celebrations. He attended an event at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, where he was joined by Marxist-Leninist leaders from across Europe and Asia. Eastern Bloc. After World War II, Stalin worked to ensure Soviet control over Eastern Europe and expand Soviet influence in Asia. Although cautious of how the Western Allies might respond, he initially avoided setting up Communist Party governments directly in Eastern Europe. Instead, he secured positions for Marxist-Leninists in coalition governments. Unlike his approach in the Baltic states, Stalin chose not to integrate these new socialist countries into the Soviet Union but recognized them as independent states. One of his challenges was that the Nazis had killed most of the region's Marxists, leaving few leaders aligned with Soviet ideologies. Stalin demanded that Germany and its Axis allies, Hungary, Romania, and the Slovak Republic, pay reparations. Knowing that socialism here had been forced by invasion rather than a natural revolution, Stalin avoided calling these states dictatorships of the proletariat and instead referred to them as people's democracies, hinting at a coalition among workers, peasants, and the lower middle class. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously remarked that an Iron Curtain had come down across Europe, marking the divide between East and West. In September 1947, Eastern European communist leaders met in Szklarska Paryba, Poland, forming an organization called Cominform to coordinate communist movements across Eastern Europe. as well as in France and Italy. Stalin did not attend this meeting himself but sent Andrei Zhdanov as his representative. Several East European communist leaders also traveled to Moscow for guidance from Stalin, where he advised them on various political issues. For example, he discouraged Yugoslavia's proposal for a Balkan federation that would include Bulgaria and Albania. Stalin had an especially tense relationship with Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito, who consistently advocated for a Balkan federation and Soviet support for communist fighters in the Greek Civil War. In March 1948, Stalin launched an anti-Tito campaign, accusing the Yugoslav communists of straying from Marxist-Leninist principles. At the Cominform conference in June 1948 in Bucharest, other Eastern European communist leaders also criticized Tito, labeling him a fascist and a Western agent. Stalin even ordered several attempts to assassinate Tito and considered invading Yugoslavia. Stalin proposed creating a unified but demilitarized Germany that would either fall under Soviet influence or remain neutral. When the US and UK opposed this, he attempted to pressure them by blockading Berlin in June 1948, hoping they would not risk war. However, the Western Allies responded by airlifting supplies into West Berlin until Stalin ended the blockade in May 1949. Later that year, the Western powers established the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. And in response, Stalin formed the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The Western Allies expected Poland to become an independent state with free elections, as previously agreed. Instead, Stalin orchestrated political manipulation in Poland, merging socialist parties into the Polish United Workers' Party, PZPR, and rigging elections to secure PZPR control. Similarly, Stalin ensured that elections in Hungary in 1947 brought the Hungarian Working People's Party into power. In Czechoslovakia, the Communists gained some genuine support, becoming the largest party in 1946. Monarchies in Bulgaria and Romania were abolished. And the Soviet Union's political model spread across Eastern Europe, with a one-party system, collectivized agriculture, and a focus on heavy industry aimed at creating economic self-sufficiency within the Eastern Bloc. In Asia, things were changing too. In October 1949, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong rose to power, proclaiming the People's Republic of China. The victory of the Chinese Communists expanded Marxist influence to nearly one-third of the world's landmass. Stalin privately admitted he had underestimated the Chinese Communists' chances of winning the Civil War, initially advising them to seek peace with the nationalist Kuomintang. But when Mao visited Stalin in December 1949, Stalin was wary that Mao might pursue an independent policy similar to Tito's in Yugoslavia. Although reluctant at first, Stalin eventually agreed in January 1950 to replace the old Sino-Soviet treaty, which was more favorable to the Soviet Union, with a new one. China desperately needed Soviet assistance after years of civil war, and Stalin made it clear that he could withdraw support if Mao deviated from Soviet interests.
Stalin and Mao believed North Korea would achieve a quick victory. The US brought the conflict to the United Nations, securing international military support for South Korea, and US-led forces soon pushed back the North Koreans. Stalin wanted to avoid direct Soviet involvement against the US, and encouraged China to send troops to aid North Korea in October 1950. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union was among the first to recognize Israel when it was established in 1948, hoping it might become an ally in the region. However, when Israeli Ambassador Golda Meir was warmly welcomed by Jewish crowds in the Soviet Union, Stalin grew angry, especially as Israel's alliance with the US strengthened. Relations soured further, leading Stalin to launch an anti-Jewish campaign within the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. In November 1948, he dissolved the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and several members faced show trials. Soviet propaganda increasingly attacked Zionism, Jewish culture, and rootless cosmopolitanism, and anti-Semitism grew more prevalent within Soviet society. Stalin's rising tolerance of anti-Semitism may have stemmed from his focus on Russian nationalism or from realizing how effectively Hitler had used anti-Semitism as a political tool. There were even rumors that Stalin was planning to deport all Soviet Jews to the Jewish Autonomous Region in Siberia's Birobidzhan area. 1950 to 1953. Final years. In his later years, Stalin's health declined, and he began taking long holidays, often spending up to 5 months each year at his dacha in Abkhazia. His distrust of doctors grew, and in January 1952, he even imprisoned one who suggested he should retire for his health. In September that year, a group of Kremlin doctors, mostly Jewish, were arrested on charges of plotting to kill Soviet officials, a case that became known as the Doctors' Plot. Stalin ordered these doctors to be tortured until they confessed. Around the same time, a trial occurred in Czechoslovakia where 13 Communist Party leaders, 11 of whom were Jewish, were accused of being part of a Zionist American conspiracy against the Eastern Bloc. Another high-profile trial in Ukraine accused Jewish industrialists of sabotage. In 1951, Stalin also launched the Mingrelian Affair, a purge targeting the Georgian Communist Party, which led to the deportation of more than 11,000 people. From 1946 until his death, Stalin made only 3 public speeches, 2 of which were very brief. His writing output also slowed significantly, though he continued to address Soviet ideology and policies. In 1950, he published an article, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, discussing aspects of Russian national identity. And in 1952, he released Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, his last book, providing guidance for future leaders. That same year, he delivered an hour-and-a-half speech at a Central Committee meeting, where he critiqued his potential successors, including Molotov and Mikoyan. He also restructured the Politburo, replacing it with a larger body known as the Presidium. On March 1, 1953, Stalin's staff found him on the floor of his bedroom at his Kuntsevo dacha, barely conscious. He was placed on a couch and cared for over the next 3 days, during which he was spoon-fed and given medication. Despite these efforts, Stalin's health continued to decline, and he passed away on March 5, 1953. The autopsy revealed he had suffered a severe stroke, and his brain arteries were greatly affected by atherosclerosis. His death was officially announced the following day, and his body was displayed for 3 days at Moscow's House of Unions. Massive crowds gathered to pay their respects, resulting in chaotic conditions that led to fatal crowd crushes. On March 9th, a large funeral was held in Red Square, with Stalin's body placed alongside Lenin's in the mausoleum. Stalin left no designated successor or clear path for transferring power, leading to a power struggle within the party. Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev soon emerged as key leaders, returning the Soviet government to a collective leadership model. They quickly began reforms, easing the heavy demands of Stalin's rule. Large-scale construction projects were scaled back, more emphasis was placed on housing development, and peasant taxes were reduced to encourage higher agricultural output. The new leadership also worked to restore relations with Yugoslavia and aimed for a less adversarial stance toward the United States, leading to a ceasefire in the Korean War in July 1953. Many political prisoners were released, and the previously persecuted doctors were freed. Additionally, an amnesty was granted to many prisoners, cutting the population of Soviet labor camps by half, and torture was officially banned in April 1953. Political ideology. Stalin claimed to have accepted Marxism when he was just 15 years old, and it became the central idea guiding him throughout his life. Some scholars believe that he had a strong commitment to Marxist beliefs, while others suggest that Marxism took on a nearly religious significance for him. Even though Stalin was never a Georgian nationalist, his early views combined some ideas from Georgian nationalism with Marxism. He thought it was essential to adapt Marxism to fit changing situations. In 1917, he famously stated that there were 2 types of Marxism, dogmatic and creative, asserting that he favored the latter. However, some scholars argue that Stalin's few new ideas and ideology were simplistic and questionable developments of traditional Marxism. Stalin believed in an unavoidable class struggle between the working class, known as the proletariat, and the wealthy class called the bourgeoisie. He thought the working class would ultimately win this struggle and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, viewing the Soviet Union as an example of such a government. To protect this proletarian state, he believed that repressive measures would be necessary against both foreign and domestic enemies, as the class struggle would become more intense as socialism advanced. He used propaganda to blame these enemies for any failures in the economy or military, as well as for the hardships faced by ordinary people. Stalin followed the Leninist interpretation of Marxism. In his book Foundations of Leninism, he wrote that Leninism represented the Marxism suited to the time of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. While he claimed to be a loyal follower of Lenin, he was not always blindly obedient. Stalin respected Lenin but did not agree with him on everything, speaking out when he thought Lenin was mistaken. During his revolutionary activities, he sometimes saw Lenin's views and actions as self-indulgent, believing they were not useful for Bolsheviks working inside Russia. After the October Revolution, their disagreements continued, although some historians argue that Stalin's friendship with Lenin was the most significant relationship in his life.
Stalin viewed nations as temporary constructs formed by capitalism, believing they could eventually merge into one global community. He considered all nations to be fundamentally equal. He stated that ethnic minorities within the Russian Empire should have the right of secession, but should not be encouraged to pursue it. Stalin feared that if these minorities became fully autonomous, they would fall under the control of the most conservative elements in their communities. His push for Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe led to accusations of Russian imperialism. Personal life and characteristics. Stalin was ethnically Georgian and grew up speaking Georgian. He didn't start learning Russian until he was around 8 or 9 years old. Some people have suggested that he might have Ossetian ancestry, but he never accepted an Ossetian identity. Instead, he was proud of being Georgian, and throughout his life, he spoke Russian with a strong Georgian accent. Some of his colleagues described him as having an Asiatic appearance. And he once remarked that he was not a European man but an Asian who had become Russian. Stalin was known for being soft-spoken and not a great public speaker. His communication style was simple and clear, avoiding fancy words and dramatic gestures. He preferred writing over speaking in front of large crowds. In adulthood, he stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall. His face had pockmarks from smallpox, a condition he had as a child. But these marks were often removed from photographs. He was born with a webbed left foot and had an injury to his left arm from childhood that left it shorter and less flexible than his right arm. Stalin was a lifelong smoker, enjoying both pipes and cigarettes. Despite his power, he lived a modest lifestyle, wearing simple clothes and using inexpensive furniture. As the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin seldom left Moscow except for vacations. He disliked traveling and refused to fly. In 1934, his Kuntsevo dacha, a residence located about 5.6 miles from the Kremlin, became his main home. He vacationed in southern parts of the USSR almost every year between 1925 and 1936 and again from 1945 to 1951. Often in Abkhazia, where he had a close friendship with its leader, Nestor Lakoba. Stalin's personality was complex. Some Soviet figures, including Trotsky, claimed he was mediocre. A view that gained popularity outside the Soviet Union during his life. However, historians note that he had a sharp mind, strong self-control, and a remarkable memory. Stalin worked hard and was an effective organizer who was eager to learn. As a leader, he paid close attention to details in various matters, including film scripts and military strategies. He evaluated people based on their inner strength and intelligence. Stalin was skilled at adapting his behavior to different audiences and was capable of deception. Although he could be rude, he rarely shouted. As his health worsened, he became more unpredictable and irritable. When he was in a good mood, he could be charming and enjoyed telling jokes. At social events, he liked singing and drinking, hoping that others would let slip secrets when they were drunk. While Stalin often lacked compassion, a trait possibly shaped by his experiences of imprisonment and exile, he did show some kindness to strangers, even during the harsh period known as the Great Purge. He had a self-righteous side and could hold grudges for years. By the 1920s, he became increasingly paranoid, believing in plots against him and conspiracies. Although he never personally participated in torture or executions, he enjoyed humiliating and degrading others, maintaining an atmosphere of fear among even his closest allies. Some scholars suggest that his personality may have included traits of paranoia and sociopathy. Others argue that his brutality was linked to his dedication to the Soviet Union's survival and the Marxist-Leninist ideology. Stalin had a strong interest in the arts. He supported certain Soviet writers, like Mikhail Bulgakov, even when their work faced criticism. He loved classical music, owned around 2,700 records, and frequently attended performances at the Bolshoi Theater during the 1930s and 1940s. His tastes were conservative. He preferred traditional drama, opera, and ballet over modern experimental art, which he dismissed as formalism. Despite his limited formal education, he was a self-taught individual and a voracious reader, amassing a personal library of over 20,000 books, mostly non-fiction. His favorite topic was history, particularly interested in famous Russian leaders such as Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Lenin was his favorite author, but he also read and respected works by Trotsky and other opponents. Relationships and family. Stalin married his first wife, Ekaterina Svanidze, in 1906. Some historians, such as Volkogonov, suggested that she was likely the only person he truly loved. When she passed away, Stalin reportedly said, "This creature softened my heart of stone." She died, and with her, my last warm feelings for humanity also died. Together, they had a son named Yakov, who often frustrated Stalin. During World War II, Yakov was captured by the German army. Despite the opportunity for a prisoner exchange with Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, Stalin refused to agree to it. Tragically, Yakov died in a Nazi concentration camp in 1943. In 1910, while in exile in Solvychetskotsk, Stalin was said to have had affairs with at least 2 women. His landlady, Maria Kozakova, gave birth to a boy named Konstantin in 1911. Konstantin later became a philosophy teacher at the Leningrad Military Mechanical Institute but never met Stalin. In 1914, while in Kuriga, Stalin, then 35, had a relationship with Lydia Pereprigina, who was 14 years old. Although she was above the legal age of consent at that time, she became pregnant. In December 1914, Pereprigina gave birth to their child, but unfortunately, the infant died shortly after. In 1916, she was pregnant again, and in around April 1917, she gave birth to their son, Alexander Davidov. Alexander was raised as the son of a peasant fisherman. Although Stalin eventually learned about Alexander's existence, he showed no interest in him. Stalin's second wife was Nadezhda Alalieva, whom he married in 1919. Their relationship was troubled, marked by frequent arguments. They had 2 biological children, a son named Vasily and a daughter named Svetlana, and adopted another son named Artyom Sergeyev in 1921. It is unclear whether Stalin had any mistresses during or after this marriage. Nadezhda suspected he was unfaithful and tragically took her own life in 1932. Stalin viewed Vasily as spoiled and often criticized his behavior. Despite being Stalin's son, Vasily was quickly promoted in the Red Army and lived a luxurious lifestyle. On the other hand, Stalin had a close and affectionate relationship with Svetlana during her childhood and had a fondness for Artyom as well. However, he disapproved of Svetlana's boyfriends and husbands, which strained their relationship. After World War II, he became increasingly distant and spent little time with his children, who started to play a smaller role in his life. After Stalin died, Svetlana changed her surname to Alalieva and eventually defected to the United States. Legacy. Historian Robert Conquest claimed that Stalin may have had a greater impact on the course of the 20th century than anyone else. There are differing opinions among Leninists about Stalin. Some see him as Lenin's true successor, while others believe he betrayed Lenin's ideals. Most Westerners and anti-communist Russians view Stalin negatively, labeling him a mass murderer. However, many Russians and Georgians regard him as a great leader and a builder of the state. Historian Dmitry Volkogonov described Stalin as one of the most influential figures in history. Historian Service argued that Stalin strengthened and stabilized the Soviet Union. In less than 30 years, he transformed the country into a significant industrial power with notable advancements in urbanization, military strength, education, and a sense of pride among Soviet citizens. Under Stalin's leadership, life expectancy increased as living conditions, nutrition, and medical care improved, leading to lower mortality rates. While many Soviet citizens disliked him, there was still considerable support for him across society. On the other hand, historian Vadim Rogovin pointed out that Stalin's purges caused significant damage to the communist movement both in the USSR and globally, damage that has never fully healed. Nikita Khrushchev also believed that Stalin's purges weakened the nation by removing important leaders from the old Bolshevik party, the military, and academia. Questions have been raised about the necessity of Stalin's policies for the Soviet Union's economic development, with some suggesting that his policies starting in 1928 may have hindered progress. Stalin's government is often described as totalitarian, with him as the authoritarian leader. Various biographers have labeled him a dictator, an autocrat, or accused him of practicing a form of personal rule. Historian Montefiore argued that while Stalin initially ruled with a Communist Party oligarchy, the government became a personal dictatorship by 1934. Solidifying his absolute power after eliminating senior military and NKVD officials between March and June 1937. In both the Soviet Union and abroad, he was often depicted as an Oriental despot. However, McDermott warned against overly simplistic portrayals of Stalin as an all-powerful tyrant controlling every aspect of life in the Soviet Union. A view often found in literature by writers such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Numerous writings on Stalin exist, with many biographies produced during his lifetime focusing on his achievements while minimizing negative aspects. Stalin preferred these biographies to overlook his early life, particularly his Georgian origins, in a country largely made up of ethnic Russians. After his death, more biographies were written, but until the 1980s, they mostly relied on the same sources. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, previously classified files on Stalin's life became accessible to historians. This newfound access made Stalin a pressing topic in the Soviet Union. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, even more archives opened, revealing new information about Stalin and generating a surge of research on his life and legacy. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of archives, some historians estimated that Stalin's regime caused the deaths of at least 20 million people or more. After the Soviet Union fell, declassified evidence revealed official records of 799,455 executions between 1921 and 1953. Around 1.7 million deaths in the Gulag, approximately 390,000 deaths during the forced resettlement of Kulaks, and up to 400,000 deaths among those deported in the 1940s, totaling about 3.3 million recorded victims in these categories. Historian Stephen Wheatcroft suggested that about 1 million of these deaths were intentional, while the rest were due to neglect and mismanagement. The deaths of at least 5.5 to 6.5 million people during the Soviet famine of 1932 to 1933 are sometimes included among the victims of Stalin's rule. He has also been accused of committing genocide, particularly through the forced relocation of ethnic minorities and the man-made Holodomor famine in Ukraine. Shortly after Stalin's death, the Soviet Union experienced a period of de-Stalinization. Malenkov condemned the cult of personality that had developed around Stalin. And this criticism was echoed in the newspaper Pravda. In 1956, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech at the party's 20th Congress, where he denounced Stalin for his mass repression and personality cult. He continued these denunciations at the 22nd Party Congress in October 1962. In October 1961, Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum and reburied in the Kremlin Wall necropolis, with a bust marking the site. That year, Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd. Khrushchev's process of de-Stalinization ended when he was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev in 1964, who introduced a degree of re-Stalinization within the Soviet Union. In 1969 and 1979, proposals were made to fully rehabilitate Stalin's legacy. But both plans were stopped due to concerns about the potential damage to the USSR's reputation. Mikhail Gorbachev viewed the complete denunciation of Stalin as essential for the renewal of Soviet society. After the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Boris Yeltsin continued to denounce Stalin but also criticized Lenin. His successor, Vladimir Putin, did not seek to rehabilitate Stalin but emphasized celebrating the achievements of the Soviet Union under his leadership, while acknowledging the repressions. In October 2017, Putin inaugurated the Wall of Grief Memorial in Moscow. In recent years, the Russian government and public have been accused of trying to rehabilitate Stalin's image. That brings us to the end of today's video. We've explored the complexities of Stalin's life, his impact on the Soviet Union, and how history continues to shape our understanding of leadership and power. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who might appreciate this deep dive into history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Stalin's legacy. What do you think? Was he a great leader or a ruthless dictator? Let us know in the comments below. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories that shape our world.